consolidated its control of Afghanistan. Iran, as well as other countries in the region, must decide on the nature of their relationship with this new Afghan state. Iran, along with Pakistan, have the greatest stake in what follows. Together with much of the rest of the world, they're looking for signs of how the Taliban intends to wield power and are carefully weighing their options. Their concerns are over refugee influx, increasing drug trafficking, and of course, the possibility of extremist groups like Islamic State and Al-Qaeda that they may strengthen under a Taliban regime, and that there may be Talibanization and urgency exported to countries in the neighborhood and beyond. More immediately, Iran and others have to decide what kind of assistance, if any, they will provide and expect in return. Iran will be particularly looking at how the new regime treats its Hazara Shiite minority. And we will see countries in the region, whether countries in the region are going to be working together to ensure a stable Afghanistan, which is in all of their interests, for perhaps for different reasons, or that they will be pursuing their own interests and creating new sources of tension. For these questions and others, we have a panel this morning that is well qualified to provide some of the answers. After presentations by the panelists and some questions of my own, we will try to answer as many questions as possible in the hour that we have. To submit your questions, please use Zoom's Q&A feature, which you can find on your Zoom screens. Feel free to ask a question anytime during the panel. For those calling in by phone or watching our panel live stream, you can ask a question by emailing events@mei.edu. If you have any technical issues, please also use events@mei.edu. And now, allow me to introduce our panel. Nilüfer Sahi is a resident senior scholar at the Atlantic Council's South Asia Center and director of policy and diplomacy at Macomb and Company. She is a professorial lecturer at George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs. Next, Mustafa Mohammed Sawar is a Prague-based broadcaster and journalist with Radio Azadi, Radio Free Europe's, Radio Liberty's Afghan service. He began working with the radio in Kabul in 2002, was for a time with Tolo Media, and joined the main headquarters of RFE-RL in Prague in 2005. He's been covering a wide range of topics on Afghanistan, including stories relating to Afghan women and youth and issues related to refugees in Afghanistan and abroad. And then Alex Van Tanka is familiar to many of our MEI audience. Alex is the director of Middle East Institute's Iran program and a senior fellow with MEI's Frontier Europe Initiative. Alex specializes in Middle East regional affairs with a particular focus on Iran. He's a prolific author. His latest book, which came out just a few months ago, is The Battle of the Alatoyas in Iran, United States foreign policy and political rivalry since 1979. So now, I should say that I am Marvin Weinbaum, the director of Afghanistan and Pakistan studies here at the Middle East Institute. And now I'm going to turn to our panelists and begin with asking Nilüfer if she would lead us off.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. And thank you, Middle East Institute and the other co-sponsoring organization, for organizing this timely event. And thank you so much, Dr. Weinberg, for moderating this panel. Well, let me start with Iran's strategic interest in Afghanistan and the region. I was looking at recently, I mean, a couple of months back, I was looking at the role of the regional players, regional powers, Russia, Iran, and China. And it struck me of knowing that how these regional powers are trying to build alliances, and how does it mean for Afghanistan. But I'll come to that at the end. But let me start with some major strategic interest of Iran in Afghanistan, the region, that they are, I think Dr. Weinberg, you also highlighted, it's around ideology, it's around economy, and it's around security. There are three major interests that Iran has. And the threats that Iran also see from Afghanistan are around these three major areas: ideology, security, and economy. So let me start with first the security element, and that is so much connected to this ideological element as well. So Iran has always welcomed, and still it welcomes, the departure of the US forces. There is no doubt, based on certain reasons, and also based on its relationship, strategic relationship with the United States. But it has concerns about the re-emergence of Sunni Shia tension with the Taliban back in power. And the threats relating to Taliban takeover and emergence of Shia and anti-Iran sentiments in Afghanistan is something that Iran sees as a major threat to going forward. And it goes back to the past, where Taliban's attitude and behavior in 1990s, with the Hazara Shiite community in Afghanistan, the atrocities with Hazara Shiite, and also the anti-Iran sentiment in Afghanistan. It also goes back to 1990s, where the relationship of Iran and Taliban actually were in a very there was tension in their relationship. And in 1998, when the Taliban killed a number of Iranian diplomats in Mazar-e Sharif, it almost sparked war between the Taliban and Iran. So Tehran or Iran relationship has been complicated in the past, especially if you look at the 1990s. But recently, and from last 2.5 years, which I call it as a political processes, started in October of 2018, political processes, which some call it as a peace process in Afghanistan, and then it has a regional component attached to it. During all those couple of years, Iran has demonstrated positive reception and diplomatic support to the Taliban. Well, it has, I think that was a strategic move, because Iran, after 1 year of the talks, and especially after the Doha agreement, Tehran believed that Taliban will be the next power holder in Afghanistan. So building a close relationship with them means implementing on reaching to the interest that Iran had, which was around the security assurances from the Taliban, which was around the Shia-Sunni or conflict, and which was around the economic aspect that Iran had, economic interest that Iran had. So the first, the Shia-Sunni, let me get back to that. The Shia-Sunni tension in Afghanistan could involve Iran in the internal affairs of Afghanistan going forward. Though Taliban has demonstrated flexibility, and they have expressed also flexibility in terms of their behavior with other ethnic groups. But that is, one should be skeptical at this moment about Taliban's any kind of statement, political statement about inclusion, about their flexibility with that other ethnic groups, because they're in the consolidating power phase. And they want to get international recognition. They want to get the flow of money. So whatever statement they are making right now, one could hardly trust on those. And with that, it is hard to see how Taliban, going forward, once their government will be in place, how they will treat this particular population. the Shia population, the Hazara Shia population, and whether that will be a threat for anti-Iran sentiment to emerge in Afghanistan. So it's pretty based on the previous atrocities of Taliban and their aggressive attitude and behavior with the Shia population of Afghanistan, one could predict something that they won't be flexible going forward. But again, as they need international recognition and money to come, they might change their attitude. So that if Taliban will be flexible, if Taliban will include this particular population of Shia and whatever government they will form, and if they will not have aggressive policies toward them, I think that ensures a positive signal with the relationship between the Taliban and Iran. But if, I'm talking about the scenarios, if Taliban will have aggressive policy towards Shia, that will create a sectarian conflict in Afghanistan. And that sectarian conflict could be a threat to Iran's security going forward. So that, therefore, we have to wait and see the Taliban's behavior with this particular population that is around the ideology that I talked, the ideology interest of Iran. So, and then that will further, Iran will be able to cement its policy going forward. Because at this particular time, as I assume all the regional players are in the wait and see movement. And what they want to see Taliban's behavior, and they are building the relationship with Taliban. And then the next step will be cementing their policy based on how Taliban react or behave with the interests that they have. So that's one element, the security element. So Taliban are behaving good, that relationship might take a shape, and Iran will be able to implement the interests that I'll talk about, the economic interests, particularly that Iran has in Afghanistan. But if that turns in a different way, that will create sectarian conflict, and the sectarian conflict in Afghanistan means a conflict between Tehran or Iran and the Taliban. On the other hand, there's also a population of Sunnis in Balochistan, Sistan, that any sectarian conflict inside Afghanistan could have impact on that particular population in Sistan of Balochistan, and that Iran in general will be impacted by that conflict if it emerged from Sistan of Balochistan. So that sectarian conflict is one angle that we need to wait and see and look closely how Taliban behavior, attitude, and policies will be towards its Shia population in Afghanistan, and if it creates or generates any anti-Iran sentiment. The other element is, of course, currently the issue, the real issue, which is around the Iranian. It goes back again to the security element or security interest, is the flow of more Afghan refugees. We all know that the Iranian economy has been hit hard by wide-ranging U.S. sanctions, and Iran is facing socioeconomic crisis right now because of those sanctions. So Iran, on the other hand, the sanctions does not allow Iran to get more international funding and aid. Right, and that therefore the flow of refugees, which reports recently show that there are high number of their waves of population actually migrating to Iran when the evacuation completed, and people are turning their faces to Pakistan, Iran now, just to escape Taliban. So with that high flow of refugee to Iran, Iran will have more socioeconomic issues and crisis inside. And that will cause also another layer of security issues inside Afghanistan, inside Iran, both in terms of the flow of refugees and also the drug trafficking and issues with the drug. So that Iran is concerned about this element, and Iran has to address that. And how to address that, of course, with next power holder, whoever will be, that now we see the Taliban, if they will be the power holder. So that Iran has to resolve that issue or talk to the power holder in order to impede further chaos, socioeconomic chaos inside Iran as a result of this refugee flow. The third interest that Iran has is, of course, economic interest. Iran and Afghanistan share a border. and that includes several lucrative trade routes. Afghanistan was one of the recently, from last at least 10 or 12 to 12 years, according to a number of reports, Afghanistan was one of the largest destination for Iranian non-oil exports, mostly to the western part, Herat, and then going to the central part of the country. So mostly the western region. So, and according to a number of reports that I had actually read, almost 2 billion of export a year. It's a huge money for Iran. And due to internal economic issues in Iran, which made rial depreciate significantly, so Iranian goods are more affordable to Afghan buyers. And Afghanistan is a good consumer market, has been a good consumer market for Iran. So now, even I was just looking at the recent report that with the recent tension in Afghanistan from last, since Taliban captured Herat, by the way, since then, the report shows that that rate dropped down. That export rate dropped down, and of course, that has had a huge impact on the trade and a huge impact on the goods that Iran used to transport to the Western region. So the instability in Afghanistan, in conclusion, will have a very negative impact on trade and Iran market. And Iran will lose its consumer. Iran will lose its market if that tension will arise and remain. So these three major interests, which is ideology, security, and economy, make Iran to have a policy of cooperation, to have a policy of flexibility with the next power holder, even if complication exists. Even if they don't like Taliban, even if there are anti-Taliban sentiments in Iran. So Iran has to build a relationship with the Taliban in order to reach to all these three areas that I explained. So for that, I mean, it from a national interest perspective, it makes a lot of sense why Iran has demonstrated positive reception and why Iran has extended diplomatic support from last 2.5 years to the Taliban. There were a couple of events that Iran hosted, Tehran hosted for the Taliban from last 2.5 years, and they tried to reach out to the Taliban again and again, first to get the security assurances, and second, to have a deeper diplomatic and strategic relationship with the Taliban in order to extend their interests that I mentioned. And that would certainly make them further build those particular relationships. So that is what Iran has to do. Now, whether the situation in Afghanistan would allow Iran to do or not, that's a question, and that is an area that we all need to look closely going forward. As I mentioned, there are other elements, by the way, in this regional game or regional, from IR perspective, that I see at the element. There are other elements which are intervening right now, which is the regional power element. The recent agreement of China, what was that, 400 billion of Chinese investment agreement with Iran. What does it mean for Afghanistan? The closer relationship of Russia with Iran, what does it mean for Afghanistan? So there are all these regional elements which I see that Iran is in the process, from what these agreements are shaping now, from all the meetings between these three players, regional players. What I concluded that, not concluded, but kind of assess and analyze, that it seems Iran's foreign policy in the region will be based on closer cooperation with China and Russia. And that's an East bloc policy that they used to have before as well. And that makes sense. Iran needs more alliances, especially with another dominant Sunni extremist version of Sunni are in power next door. Iran does need more alliances. On the other hand, how the relationship with Pakistan fares, that's another question, because Pakistan is more closer to the Taliban than Iran. So Iran cannot isolate itself in the current situation because of the three areas that I mentioned. So therefore, makes a lot of sense for Iran to have a close relationship with them. And on the other hand, Iran tries to build those regional power alliance building relationship that is, in theory, makes a lot of sense. In practice, we see that alliances don't marry. They romance for a short period of time and they break up. So we have to really see that if they marry for a long term, these three powers, regional powers, especially with all the investment agreements and bilateral agreements they are making, their participation in OIC, and many other elements and factors which comes in. So these are, yes, Dr. Van. You are on mute.
Thank you so much. That's very comprehensive, and but I'm sure there's still a great deal to discuss, and Mustafa will take us in that direction. Thank you, Mustafa.
Thank you. Sure, I'll be there for continuation and more questions. Thank you.
Sure, Mustafa, would you like to go ahead?
Thank you very much for having me on this timely discussion. So as you know, the withdrawal of all US troops from Afghanistan after almost 20 years of war in the war-shattered country has raised many questions and concerns, both inside and outside Afghanistan. Many ask that what will happen next and what the future will hold for them. At the regional level, as Dr. Sakhi mentioned, many stakeholders, including Iran, they have their own stakes and interests, and they were repeatedly calling for a responsible US withdrawal from Afghanistan. One interpretation of the phrase responsible withdrawal was that Afghanistan should not be plunged into another bloody civil war and further instability, and should not again become a safe haven for international terrorists. The United States has repeatedly, time and again, said that the main purpose of its presence in Afghanistan was to prevent it from ever becoming a safe haven for international terrorists. Every country in the region, especially neighboring countries such as Pakistan, Tajikistan, China, and Iran, has specific objectives in Afghanistan that are inextricably linked to their national security interests. Iran has several major concerns in Afghanistan. First, the security of its eastern borders. Second, the presence of Sunni extremist fighters affiliated with the Islamic State radical group. And third, the influx of a new wave of Afghan refugees into Iran. IS affiliates in Afghanistan operate under the banner of Khorasan province. Khorasan is a historic region comprising of a large territory now situated in parts of today's Afghanistan and Iran. IS has repeatedly targeted the Shiite community in Afghanistan with deadly attacks. For example, it has attacked schools, sports centers, religious places, and so on. So it has been a security challenge both for Afghanistan and for neighboring countries such as Iran. And we know from reports that there are now more than 2 million undocumented and over 800,000 registered Afghan refugees in Iran. The US sanctions, as was mentioned, on Iran have forced the country to encourage many Afghan refugees to return to Afghanistan. And we had reports from our correspondents that thousands have returned to Afghanistan. Now, Iran is worried about an influx of more refugees from Afghanistan. We have seen reports that hundreds of Afghans have recently fled to Iran from various parts of Afghanistan, including border provinces such as Nimroz, after the fall of the provinces into the hands of the Taliban. The United Nations has announced that nearly 500,000 refugees could leave Afghanistan by the end of the year. It has called on Afghanistan's neighbors to leave their borders and doors open. Our colleagues in Radio Farda just recently talked to Afghans who are now living in the city of Zahedan, the capital of Sistan and Balochistan province of Iran, bordering Afghanistan. A number of young Afghans said that they had reached Zahedan through difficult routes, with the help of human traffickers mainly. One of them said that in order to provide food for 8 members of his family, he had to do harsh labor, such as construction work. Almost all of them said that they were living under dire conditions in Zahedan of Iran. Some of them want to reach Turkey and Western Europe via Iran. But these days, you know that the gates of Europe are also closed. So these concerns have led Iran to pursue its objectives linked to its national security interest in Afghanistan, mainly through proxies, some experts believe. Let me give you an example that in early 2020, then US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo accused Iran of using the Taliban to undermine Afghanistan's peace efforts. Without providing specific details to support his allegations, Pompeo spoke of Iran's alleged contacts with Tora Bora group and Mullah Dadullah group, 2 little-known groups that some experts believe are the Taliban splinter groups. However, that is not much clear. But what is clear is that Iran had relations with both the government led by Ashraf Ghani, who departed Afghanistan, and the Taliban. For instance, in July, Tehran hosted a meeting of then Afghan government representatives and a high-level Taliban political delegation. And a day after the Taliban took control of Kabul, Ebrahim Raisi, the new president of Iran, described the US withdrawal as a military failure, adding that the withdrawal must become an opportunity to restore life, security, and durable peace in Afghanistan. Raisi was quoted as saying that Iran backs efforts to restore stability in Afghanistan, adding that as a neighboring and brother nation, Iran invites all groups in Afghanistan to reach a national agreement. The Taliban have reassured countries in the region not to worry, but some countries such as Iran, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan are concerned already. Iranian officials in the past have said that Tehran wants the Taliban to be part of the future solution in Afghanistan and not the whole of the future solution for Afghanistan. But now the Taliban have seized control of all the country except for the strategic mountainous Panjshir province. We know that there's been animosity between Shiite Muslim Iran and Sunni Muslim Taliban for years, especially during the first reign of the Taliban in Afghanistan in the 1990s. The main question now is how Iran and the Taliban will cooperate and work together. We recall that in late 2020, the then Foreign Minister Jawad Zarif told Tolo News during an exclusive interview that the Taliban has committed many terrorist acts, adding that Iran has not removed the Taliban from what he said, our list of terrorist groups in our laws, he added. Those remarks apparently upset the Taliban. We recall that Taliban spokesperson Zabiullah Mujahid in a statement called the remarks as irresponsible and misconceived, adding that such remarks by Iranian officials have the potential of harming relations between 2 friendly and neighboring countries. He added that the Islamic Emirates is not in any UN terror list, he added. So it remains to be seen that how Iran's relations with the Taliban will be shaped in the months to come. I leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mustafa. Thank you for stressing some of those issues. And now, Alex Sabantenka, please.
Thank you, Marvin. You've given us 10 minutes, so forgive me for trying to go through a set of bullet points now to give a sense of what I think is the policy debate in Tehran. So this is, my remarks would be reflecting what's been discussed in Tehran in terms of Afghanistan, as opposed to the debate in Kabul about Iranian policies. And I'll sort of divided my remarks into 3 segments. I'll talk about the official reaction so far to what is happening in Afghanistan in recent weeks. I'll talk about scenarios in terms of events in Afghanistan that could pull Iran into that country. And I'll talk about scenarios in terms of the Taliban takeover, kicking off a new round of regional geopolitical competition. Let me start off by giving you a sense of how the reaction has been in Tehran to the Taliban takeover. I mean, given the ideological opposition that the Islamic Republic of Iran has had and continues to have to the United States, it's unsurprising that the Iranian official reaction has been one of joy, and that the United States withdrew and the way that it withdrew. I mean, if you look at Iranian state-run media, it's painted as a picture of failure. Saying that, there is no victory claim either on the part of the Iranians. There is no Iranian claim that they had a hand in the way the Americans withdrew from Afghanistan. There's certainly no claim that Taliban is a partner in waiting for Iran. And I think that gets us a clear picture in terms of how Iran right now is still on the fence. I would say that state-run media in Iran are echoing or sharing the same messaging points that you see come out of Russia and China, which talks about this issue in a broader context of the United States having failed in Afghanistan, about a general American decline, about the idea of nation building as a foreign policy agenda to having failed, and Afghanistan being a prime example of it. So you definitely see the Iranians, the Russians, the Chinese speaking the same language. There are also conspiracy theories in Tehran, and I have to say it's not limited to Tehran. You hear that elsewhere in the region. You certainly hear it from Beijing and Moscow, which talk about why did the Americans leave the way they did. It's a conspiracy theory, but in a nutshell, this conspiracy theory tells us that the United States left the way it did to restart a new civil war in Afghanistan, with the mission being to pull Russia, China, and Iran into a new Afghan quagmire. As I said, it's a conspiracy theory, but it's one that is being mentioned, and it's not limited to Iran. But scratch the surface, and you see Iranian doubts, even in policymaking circles. Doubts about Taliban, doubts about the future. These are very evident early on after the Taliban takeover. Many Iranian officials and analysts are warning Taliban has not changed. They're saying so openly, and they're providing media platforms to Afghans to repeat the same message in Iranian media operations, that the Taliban has not changed, which I think is very interesting. It's not the official Iranian line, but the fact that state-run media are providing platforms for those sorts of sentiments to be expressed, I think is quite telling. And I would say this fear about the Taliban taking over has, in recent days, really become more pronounced if you read and listen to Iranian officials. Let me just say a few words about the scenarios in terms of internal Afghan situation. Some are immediate concerns. We've heard some of them from my colleagues on the panel. Some of our longer term concerns to worry about. Take the economic issue. Afghanistan in recent years has emerged as a key Iranian market for exports, top 5 with Turkey, Iraq, UAE. Afghanistan is among the top. It's about a $5 billion trade. It's not huge amounts of money, but for sanction hit Iran, it cannot sell and trade normally. Afghanistan has become a lucrative, relatively speaking, lucrative export market. This market now is in doubt. This will hit some Iranian exporters. Is it going to shift Iranian strategic policy towards Afghanistan? I doubt it. but some people will be hitting their pockets because of what's going on in next door Afghanistan. The security issue has been mentioned. One thing that we should remember is the return of civil war, and I think Mustafa mentioned 2-3 million refugees in Iran. We don't know how many Afghans are actually in Iran. There are no solid figures. There are many illegals. There are many who've lived there since the 1980s. Some have naturalized. Obviously, they don't count as Afghan refugees anymore. But one thing we should remember is Afghanistan population, if I'm not mistaken, has doubled in the last 20 years. So it's gone from something like 20 million to close to 40 million. So economic migration or fleeing civil war could be very different in terms of magnitude than anything Iran has seen in the past. Should, and God forbid, but should Afghanistan sink into a new round of civil war, Pakistan, Iran will be, have been, and continue to be the first recipient countries. Many will want to continue onwards to Europe, but in the first instance, it will be Iran and Pakistan will have to take the burden. Look, one thing that you do hear a lot, Marvin, also is that the recommendations in Tehran is to keep your options open. Talk to everyone. Talk to Karzai. Talk to Abdullah. Talk to Ahmad Massoud. Talk to anyone, including the Taliban, because you don't know what will happen in terms of the few next weeks and months. This situation is so fluid. But at the same time, the one thing that you do hear being recommended again and again from official level and among the community of scholars who look at Afghanistan and Tehran is the desire and the need to push the Taliban and those that support Taliban, particularly Pakistan, to accept the need for what they call an inclusive government. And that's a code for the minorities to be included. And this is a big question mark for the Iranians. Will Taliban want to do it all alone? The last few days of some of the names that are being mentioned as being making the core Taliban government, these are all core Pashtun figures. Does not suggest an inclusive government is in the making. And that is a fear in Iran. Because that means Taliban wants to do it alone, go it alone, as I should say, and that would mean a civil war. But then again, I just have to emphasize this. This is being said very carefully. They don't want to upset the Taliban. They still want to see what happens if this Taliban really has perhaps changed from the Taliban that Iran last dealt with in the 1990s, which, as you heard, almost went to war with the Talibs over the killing of the diplomats in Hazara Shiite. The other thing is the Iranians are very careful not to link the Taliban specifically to any countries. In the 1990s, Iran said Taliban is a product of Saudi Arabia. Iran doesn't talk about this Taliban the same way anymore. Again, it's part of Iran's wait and see and keep their options open. And we heard about sectarianism before. Iran is playing that card very carefully too. When there was a suggestion that some of the Fatimiyun fighters would be pulled from Syria to go to Afghanistan, the Iranian state media were very quick to quote Iranian officials saying that's not going to happen. Fatimiyun are not going to Afghanistan to fight the Taliban as part of a sectarian new front emerging in that country. Iran doesn't want to go there, not yet. Obviously, ISIS, Khorasan is a different issue, but it doesn't seem to be the primary concern right now for the Iranians, although obviously Iran will always have to worry about jihadist Sunni anti-Shia elements emerging. That was the reason why they allegedly went to Iraq and Syria over the last decade. If they believe ISIS Khorasan is going to find a foothold or firm foothold in Afghanistan, then it's going to be tough for them ideologically not do anything about it. So time will show. Marvin, I want to make sure we have time for questions. So let me quickly go through my last set of points. The Iranians don't think Taliban can run Afghanistan. Then they say it, all right? They're saying it to the Pakistanis, which in Iran's perspective is the mastermind behind everything Taliban is doing the last few weeks. They're saying to the Pakistanis, tell your friends in Taliban that Afghanistan as a society has changed. If you want to stay in power, you've got to share power. And if you share power, then you will find more regional states will want to support you in that endeavor. But if you want to go it alone, and if you want to be sectarian, then it's going to be a very different story. So I think that's the message that constantly has been sent to Islamabad. Can we go back to the zero-sum game of the 1990s? I mean, that's a question we all ought to ask. I think the Iranians think that region has moved on. I don't think the Iranians think Pakistan will play the sectarian card in backing the Taliban the way that it did in the 1990s. Pakistan today is much more sensitive to the danger of sectarianism for its own internal security, given the Shia population of Pakistan. So that's at least an Iranian observation, if not a hope. The idea of a new civil war in Afghanistan and the idea of the fragmentation of Afghanistan as a country. It's not just about the question of flow of refugees anymore. You know, we're going to go back to the kind of conversations people had in the 60s. Greater Pashtunistan. Again, the Iranians are hoping that the Pakistanis do not like the idea of Greater Pashtunistan suddenly coming back on the agenda. Therefore, will push for stability in Afghanistan and keep the borders the way they are. I have too many more points to go through. I want to spare you because I really want to get to the Q&A, Marvin, but just let me round up with the final remarks. Iran does believe Taliban has changed, but largely not fundamentally, and that's a concern. But they have to find a way to work with it. Iran is in a state of wait-and-see stance right now, but it wants to make that inclusive government in Kabul as its first litmus test for the new Taliban, if there is indeed a new Taliban. It will, if forced, seek to recreate the old Taliban, anti-Taliban bloc, regional bloc of the 1990s, including Russia, maybe even India, although there's been lots of tensions in Iranian-Indian relations over the last decade because of India's closeness to the United States. But nonetheless, India is a factor. And I think Hossein Amir Abdullahian, the Iranian foreign minister, is already planning a visit to India to talk about the future of Afghanistan. The one wild card here is China. China was not a factor in the 1990s. And if you listen to the Taliban leadership, China is a big hope for economic rescuing at the very least. Again, what will that do to Iranian policies remains to be seen. But rest assured, Iran does indeed have an east or look east policy. And in that sense, if the Chinese play their cards right, perhaps they could integrate Iran and Pakistan with Chinese lordship on top as a way of integrating the region and helping the Afghan economy as a way of stabilizing that country. Okay, so yeah, I mean, basically, I could go on here. You gave me
I know you can.
Half an hour, but let me just stop here, Marvin. But just say it's the inclusive government. I just want to repeat that one issue because that's the one that really jumps at me. It's the inclusive government in the short term that Taliban has as a test as far as Tehran is concerned. If they can bring Hazaras and Uzbek and Turkmen and others in, then Iran will maybe have hope that it can work with this version of Taliban, unlike the one from the 1990s. I'll stop here.
Alex, thanks for packing as much into those 10 plus minutes as you did. Let me just observe, though, that inclusiveness here can be fictitious as well. And I'm sure you well understand that, as do the panelists, that there may be the illusion here of incorporation, but in fact, it is a window dressing for the international community. And I think that very likely is what we're going to see. But to really share power, it strikes me, goes against the grain of the Taliban. They didn't come this far to share power. Let me raise a little different question. What are the consequences for what has happened here for the Iranian-Saudi relationship? The Saudis, after all, played a role in the 90s in the Taliban's, they recognized them and they assisted them at least for a while. Is there any implications here for that rivalry? Anyone?
I'll take it very quickly, Marvin. Look, again, it's not the 1990s. Saudi Arabia today, under the leadership of Mohammed bin Salman, whether they're going to succeed or not remains to be seen. But they're obviously walking away from religious fundamentalism as a political vehicle. They're turning inwards Mohammed bin Salman is trying to cultivate the economy. It's the Saudi nationalist message he's going after. So for him to invest, and I mean, Saudi Arabia overall across the region is reconsidering its geopolitical investments because simply they haven't worked. From Lebanon to Yemen, it hasn't worked. So the idea that Saudi Arabia right now would go back and repeat what didn't work essentially in the 1990s, I think it's far-fetched. They're going to hope they don't have to. It could even be an opportunity for cooperation of sorts on a regional level, including in Iran. And let me just remind everyone, Saudi Arabia and Iran have had 3 rounds of talks already in recent months. There's hope in Tehran that the Saudi embassy will reopen sometime in the near future. So, you know, things have to really get much worse in Afghanistan. And we really have to go to cutthroat geopolitical zero-sum mentality before the Saudis and the Iranians would want to sort of, you know, pull out the daggers and go at each other the way they did in the 1990s. In the meantime, I think it could, you know, in a best case scenario, be a place for cooperation, the future of Afghanistan.
And just to add on what Alex said, I think what I see the regional computation going on, it's not more about the religious ideology anymore, just in the 90s. It's more about the economic investment and economic interest. So the ideological interest is getting a second seat. And the economic interest of this countries are getting the first seat in terms of their interest. So that's why they're all meeting. They are trying to sign bilateral agreements for that economic expansion of the interest that they have. Though, with all that said, that's the mood. That's the regional mood at this particular time. Looking at all the meeting going on, all this regional economic investment that these players are talking about. But the situation might change. If there is a scenario in Afghanistan, if the civil war will erupt, and if there will be a sectarian conflict in Afghanistan, then we will see the role and the relationship between Saudis and Iran will shift. And that ideology comes at that part as a major element. But for the time being, as Alex mentioned, I also don't see a religious ideology playing the prominent or significant role.
And while we're talking about broader consequences, any meaning here for the U.S.-Iranian negotiations, nuclear negotiations? Does this change in any way the kind of way in which Iran particularly will approach those negotiations? Mustafa, any thought about that? Mustafa? Or anyone?
Yes.
Oh, go ahead.
Thank you. Could you please repeat the question?
No, I was saying that, are there any implications in these new developments here for the ongoing negotiations between the United States and Iran on the nuclear revival of the nuclear agreement?
Well, I would, Dr. Weinbaum, leave that to our analysts in this panel discussion. But I would like to add, a few words about your question regarding the stakes that Saudi Arabia has in Afghanistan. To me, it's interesting that Qatar has taken over part of the game now for quite some time. For example, it has hosted the Taliban negotiations with the Americans and also with the Afghans. We also know that it has tried to help the Taliban resume operations at the Kabul airport. Recently, it was reported that a delegation from Qatar went to Kabul. There are reports that our analysts can, of course, talk about it in details, that Qatar and Iran have had close ties. But Iran and Saudi have had, of course, tense relations in the past and now. So this is where the rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Qatar and Iran can be considered in the context of Afghanistan? Thank you.
Marvin, a very quick response, if I may.
Yeah, please.
Look, over the course of the last few years, basically the Iranians' method of operating, and it's a big question, but very succinctly, if I could be succinct, put is this. We talk to the West, particularly the United States, on the nuclear issue in one framework. We talk about everything else separately. So let's divide the region. For one reason, they don't want to talk about their missiles. They don't want to talk about what Iran is doing with the proxies in places like Syria and Iraq. So they don't want to mix the two, because Iran fears that mixing the two, it ends up having to be asked to make more concessions, that the nuclear concessions we broaden to include non-nuclear concessions from the West. Therefore, they've kept it very separate. A third path forward exists, which is to say, let's at least talk about regional files where there is overlap of interest. And Afghanistan certainly would be one of those files. And it has, or it should have, a major interest on the part of the Europeans to be involved in it. And this, again, the Europeans, which over the course of the last 7, 8, 9 months have more or less followed the lead by President Biden, this White House, and they will continue to do that on the nuclear front, but they can lobby, if you will, Washington to consider this third path, which is to talk to Iran, not about its missiles, because the Iranians refuse to talk about it, but let's talk about something where there is overlap of interest. And we, by the way, the Europeans are very concerned about the large flow of refugees coming our way from Afghanistan through Iran, Turkey, to come to Europe. We just can't handle more refugees. So there is a third path, but it requires the Iranian government of Ibrahim Raisi, which is obsessed with Russia and China, to admit to the fact that this decline of American power that they talk about, there might be a decline, but it's not going to happen overnight. It's probably not going to happen for years to come, if ever. So why not talk to America and allies in the region as part of an effort that Iran says it's committed to, which is to stabilize Afghanistan? And I think, again, that would be, if you ask me, the smart thing to do for the Iranians.
And part of the reason the question is because, as has been observed here, very likely Iran is going to move more closely now to China and Russia. And of course, their cooperation in the execution of any kind of agreement has been absolutely critical. So I raise it that way. Nilüfer, we never, and we have some questions, and I'm trying to absorb some of the questions as I go on here. We haven't talked about women and inclusiveness. Any thoughts on this regard? In this regard?
Sure. Yes. Before coming to the women and inclusivity, that I think Alex also clearly mentioned about the inclusivity, I would like to talk about the next one, the first one that you raised, the first question about the nuclear weapon and whether it will have any impact on that. I think Afghanistan could pose both threat and opportunity for this particular ambition of Iran. So getting closer, as you mentioned, Dr. Weinberg, getting closer to China and Russia, it will make Iran case stronger at the negotiation with the United States. And on the other hand, as you also mentioned about the stability, but Afghanistan plays a role here. It could play a stable Afghanistan could provide opportunity for Iran to proceed with this, with the negotiation with the United States. So Afghanistan over here, that therefore, I think this is a business issue for Iran. Keeping and maintaining and building or a stable Afghanistan or helping building a stable Afghanistan, it's a business for Iran. And Iran government is using all its influence with Taliban and will be using most of its influence with Taliban leaders to become a strategic and economic partner as Iran marches towards it is objective of getting a nuclear weapon. So wants to use this as an opportunity, helping, building, and connecting with the Taliban and towards a stable Afghanistan, because that is a business issue for Iran. Now, getting back to the women's and inclusivity, I think I would see also it is really problematic looking at the the whole concept of inclusivity, what Taliban are right now making a case. They might share positions, but they are not in a position to share, or in kind of an agreement to share with one another, to share power with all other ethnic groups and with women. So they clearly said, one of their spokesperson clearly said that they will not include women in leadership position. And by leadership position means the ministerial role that women used to be in as a minister, and they used to be as ambassador. They worked from last 20 years. So they will clearly said, and by the way, I was watching one of the argument, which was not logical at all, the argument that they had, that I watched it myself and heard it myself, that, well, in the entire world, if you see the statistic, women are not holding many of the leadership positions. So why expectation is from us? That's how Taliban actually reacted to their notion of not excluding women from leadership position, which does not make a very logical argument at this particular point. So yes, there is fear that women will be, if women are allowed to work, they will be given only a lower position, clerical position or very lower other positions, but they will not allow at the decision-making role. And therefore, there are right now a campaign going on inside Afghanistan also in order to include women in the government and include women in the decision-making positions that they used to be involved from last 20 years.
There are so many women who are employed in the civil service, and I'm wondering, with their prohibition against men and women working together, how you can have them engaged in offices where up until now they have been working together with men. So I think that the very statement that they make here, the women can work, is going to have some very strong and obvious qualifications. Our time is now drawing to a close. Do any of you want to make any final statements that would cover perhaps anything we hadn't said? Or Alex, you seem on the verge of one of these.
If you don't mind, Marvin, just very quick, observation on my part. Since the Arab Spring unfolded about 10 years ago, Iran has been heavily investing in the Arab world. And one reason it could do that was because the presence of the United States in Afghanistan was essentially a huge net gain for Iran. Afghanistan might have had and did obviously experience instability and some civil war with the Taliban still operating. But Iran didn't have to wonder about the flow of refugees, drugs, and a civil war next door. Now it has to. And what I wanted to say, Marvin, is I wonder what this will do to the Iranian bigger regional strategy of investing in the Arab world in places like Syria, which does not share a border with Iran, when Iran needs those resources now on the border, in eastern border in Khorasan province, where you could potentially have to deal with crisis next door. So this might have ramifications for in my view, the excessive Iranian involvement in the Arab world, and the Afghan situation might force Iran, because Iran has limited capacity now, thanks to the sanctions. And it doesn't have a popular mandate to be in the Arab world. And the Iranians want to see their foreign policy reflect national security interests that are about protecting the homeland, if you will, as opposed to pursuing some more ideological agenda, which I would say Syria could be one of those. So yeah, I do want to sort of point out that this could have an implication for Iranian foreign policy in the region. And how that works out remains to be seen, but as I say, watch this space.
And just
that's an interesting observation. I would say, anyone else want to conclude?
Last point that since it's a very critical time for Afghanistan, and Taliban are really pushing hard for legitimacy. We're really pushing hard for international recognition for all these regional countries, neighboring countries, United States, and all the other players to recognize them. So whatever political statements they are making, I mean, one should be very skeptical about it. In terms of inclusivity, in terms of women's role, in terms of their good relationship and better economic relationship with the neighboring countries, in terms of assurance of security to these neighboring countries. I mean, the regional and neighboring countries, including Iran, should be skeptical. They should not make decisions. They should not summon their policies based on what their statements are right now, because it's not, they cannot be trusted at this particular time. They are in the phase of consolidating power and getting that recognition from the world. And whatever they say, it could be a frame in order to show a different face of them, which I think would be problematic designing a foreign policy at this particular time. And Iran and other neighboring countries developing their policy towards Afghanistan at this particular time is not really wise moving forward.
It strikes me that bringing together compatibility here of wanting assistance, wanting recognition, wanting aid, may run into their own belief system, so that they can certainly welcome everything, but if others expect to get in return the kind of performance that satisfies them, the Taliban may, unlike a non-ideological state, may very well draw a line here, which would preclude their getting the kind of assistance that they want. Mustafa, any last thoughts that you want to express? Because our time has run out, and
you know, that's as it was mentioned, the international community has sent a message to the Taliban that they're going to judge the Taliban based on their deeds, not based on their words. We have seen, a lot of remarks by the Taliban. For example, they announced general amnesty, and they said that they don't want to see the women to be victims, and that they do not have any issues with those who worked with the previous government. But we are receiving, different reports from different parts of Afghanistan. For example, when we talk to women, they have women have borne the brunt of the long war in Afghanistan. In the last 20 years, women have achieved a lot. They have, worked as ministers, ambassadors, and members of parliament. And they have, have achieved tremendously in the past 20 years in different and various walks of life. For example, including sports, music, and art. Now they are worried, and now they do not know what the future will hold for them, basically. I interviewed just recently the former Afghan Minister of Women Affairs, Hasina Safi, and I asked her the question whether she thinks that the Taliban, there is a women minister in the Taliban's sort of cabinet in the future, and she said that there should be women at the top positions. But as it was mentioned, just recently we heard that Abbas Sanakzai, one of the high-ranking Taliban figures, indicated that there might not be any women at top government positions. So they also talk about an open and all-inclusive Islamic government, but many ask that what do they mean actually by an open and all-inclusive Islamic government? There are questions that whether their inclusive version of any political structure include former players or figures in Afghanistan, such as former President Karzai or Abdullah, or others who fought against them So there is, you know, a lot of unclarity at this point. It remains to be seen in the weeks and months to come, though. Thank you.
Thank you, and I want to thank the panel for a very edifying panel this morning. Thank also those of you who submitted questions. I did try to incorporate in this discussion here many of your questions. Sorry if I didn't get specifically to your question. And I want to thank also the viewing audience here for being with us, going a little over time here. This, I think, is certainly has opened up all kinds of possibilities that we'll be following for some time. I think Afghanistan is going to remain on, on our radar for some time, and we have yet really to see some of the kinds of developments that are going to capture international attention. So again, thank you all, and a good morning.